What would you do if the person you loved most suddenly became helpless? Would you protect them? Or would you reveal who you truly are when you think no one is watching? This is the story of a man who had everything: power, money, influence, except certainty. So he made a decision that would change his life forever. He closed his eyes and pretended never to open them again. Before we go any further, subscribe to the channel and like this video. Stories like this aren't just about drama. They're about human nature, loyalty, and the truths that only surface in the dark. And trust me, the ending will make you question everything. Now tell me in the comments, if your partner suddenly lost everything, their sight, their power, their fortune, would your love stay the same? Be honest. I want to see what you would do. He pretended to be blind to test his wife's loyalty. What happened next shocked everyone. Chief Henry Lewis had the kind of life that photographs made look effortless. A broad-shouldered man in tailored suits, a house that sat back from the road behind iron gates, 2 polished cars in the drive, and a reputation carved out over decades of work and influence. People in the city greeted him with deference. News anchors called for comment, and his name opened doors others could not even find the hinges to. Yet, in the rooms of his own home, away from handshakes and ceremonial ribbons, he kept a different ledger, one with ink that stung. Love, he had learned, is not proof against loneliness. He had loved Amora, as if loving could render him invulnerable. He had taken pride in the way she moved through society, like a comet everyone wanted to follow. That pride is a fragile thing. It will crack under the weight of a single look that does not return. Amora was all surface and carefully lit moments. People described her as beautiful in the way an art critic describes a painting, not raw, but composed. She smiled when cameras were effortless, laughed at jokes she had commissioned, kissed Henry at charity balls with a rehearsed warmth. Yet there were nights when, sat across their dining table, Henry would watch the way she watched him. Not with the sharp, unblinking interest of early marriage, but with a measured caution, as if guarding an investment. He told himself that husbands do not notice such things, that wealth brings distance as easily as it brings comfort. It was his mother who refused such rationalizations. Mrs. Helen Lewis had the quiet certainty of an old oak. In the kitchen, where light pooled around her knuckles and years had softened her voice, she spoke of instincts like the weather, a thing noticed and not always believed. "There is a small thing," she said one evening, stirring tea with ceremonial deliberation. "A small coldness in the house. It is not your fault, Henry. It is a woman with something to hide." She did not accuse, but she did not need to. Seeded by a mother's glance, suspicion held its own gravity. The practical seed fell in a voice at the other end of a schoolyard line. Mr. Fred from St. Barnabas rang with an apology that sounded like a reprimand. 2 little boys had been left at the gate this afternoon, the younger 2, Geoffrey and Gabriel. The teacher had waited. Amora had been somewhere else, or she had been very late, and the teacher had been concerned enough to call the father. The call slid across Henry's calm like a stone. It was not a single forgotten pickup he feared. It was the implication that she could be careless with things he cherished, with children who bore his name and whose childhoods were fragile as glass. That night, Henry did not sleep. In the rooms of the house, the clocks ticked in different languages. He remembered with the clarity of guilt a year when Amora had laughed at a costume party, her hand brushing his in public, then hurried from the room to take a private call. He remembered her phone always buzzing with a discreet insistence, tucked like contraband in coat pockets. He watched her smile when she read messages that he could not see. He lay awake imagining the small thefts of attention that might become larger. He shared little, because he had always been the kind of man who solved things quietly. But David, a friend from the old district, blunt, loyal in ways that simply meant he told the truth, sat opposite him in the study and listened. They drank black coffee and spoke in the language men use when the stakes are private and precise. "Trust is a currency," David said. "You can either keep it or you can audit it. You want to know which it is." Henry wanted to know. The want was not neatly moral. There was fear tangled with anger, the practical envy of a man who had provided everything and yet felt something given elsewhere. When David suggested measures, he did so with a caution that might have been shame. "You could watch," he said. "You could find out." He spoke of discreet oversight, of clarifying facts before confronting the house with flames. Henry had the means. He had Dr. James, their family doctor, a man of careful hands and fewer questions than most, who could offer medical charades that looked convincing from a distance. He had a lawyer, Mr. Adewale, ready to move money the moment a justification appeared. Henry was not without resources. His problem was not whether he could watch, but whether watching would make him better. There is a point in every decision at which one realizes the moral cost. Henry realized it as he signed a consent form in a small clinical room, the paper crisp under his fingers. The doctor did not lecture. He offered professional explanations, the vetted phrases people use when they must make the impossible appear plausible. Henry had told himself that this was a test. He had rehearsed the phrase, "a temporary condition," until it tasted like a vow. He had told himself that to learn the truth was worth a deception. That the house that housed his family deserved the clarity of evidence more than it deserved the preservation of illusion. Yet later, as bandages were wrapped and a black silk patch came to rest over his face, he felt the strangeness of becoming someone who could be watched. They did not dramatize the act. Henry learned in private how to accept help with the simplest tasks. He learned how to judge tone without catching a glance. He learned, too, the small economies of silence, how to make the smallest sound mean the largest thing. The cameras were installed where eyes were least expected. The study, the upstairs landing, the family kitchen where the boys did their homework. Not all were hidden. Some were placed in plain sight to catch the instinctive face. The recorders hummed in the background like insects. Henry had the feeds routed to a small screen in a room he now occupied daily, and he watched his own life pass by in fragments of light. For a while, Amora was the picture wife. She tended to him with a poised compassion that could have passed for love if one believed in gestures alone. Adjusting a cushion, smoothing a stray curl, whispering reassurances. In public, she touched his arm like an emblem. In private, the camera showed what a photograph never could. A lunchtime meeting at a small cafe across town recorded laughter that felt intimate. Late-night voices caught on a patio were steady and conspiratorial. Henry watched a man named Jake, younger, wiry, with a confidence that came from needing applause not proven by family, appear in rooms he had imagined private. The footage did not reveal love as a single trait. It revealed economy. Jake treated the infant Evelyn with a tenderness that made Henry's stomach fold. Evelyn, with a small foot that wriggled at the edge of a lap, regarded Jake as a familiar island. She reached for him, her fingers clumsy and trusting. Henry watched how Jake would lean down and speak to her in hushed, soft consonants, as if teaching a language of protection. The sight stabbed at something both paternal and possessive in Henry. The cameras showed private conversations in the guest room, where plans and casual cruelties threaded their way into laughter. The tone of several recorded exchanges shifted from affection to hard bargaining. A future was being outlined in the hushed certainty of conspiratorial voices. There are things that make a man physical, the fever of fury, the need to act. Henry felt those things, but he also felt the icy skill of someone who has always used influence. He played the recordings not for revenge, but for verification. In the grainy monochrome of the footage, Amora and Jake spoke of inheritance, of the value of patience, the possibility of removing a hurdle, words that were more suggestion than plan, but which, placed together, had a gravity heavier than any single phrase. Henry did not hear details. He heard the intent. He refused to listen for method. There was no taste for the moral stain of exactitude. In a different clip, Amora laughed at something Jake said, and then, softening, spoke of the boys. "Nathaniel is yours," she said, a line Henry clung to, as if a single phrase could rescue a world. The camera, doing what it does without mercy, captured her casualness when she added, "The others, we didn't expect them to be his." Henry's hands were steady when he rewound the recorded line, but his chest had the tremor of animal shock. The word paternity carries with it 1,000 private leaves. The way a man's face might change at a school play, the way a child's touch is counted in the geometry of a family. To have doubt planted, not as a private whisper but as a recorded fact, was to have the house itself betray him. The boys continued their small, oblivious lives. Nathaniel, taller than his years and heavy with the sort of seriousness Henry had once mistaken for his own, still loved his father in the simple currency of a child. Geoffrey and Gabriel, younger, still climbed into laps and made messes. Henry watched them from behind the bandage and found himself learning how to lie without cruelty. There was a scene he returned to again and again on the screen. Amora cooking in the evening, a child on her hip, Jake smoothing the child's hair. It was a tableau of domestic certainty, and Henry could not disassemble the tenderness he saw without remembering that tenderness had been given elsewhere too. When the recorded evidence began to outline deliberation rather than accident, the decisions turned harder. Henry and Dr. James talked in low voices about contingencies. Mr. Addywall drafted the thin but necessary scaffolding of asset protection. Documents that could be signed, hold placed on accounts, transfers to be enacted if the house fractured. Henry let lawyers prepare the formalities because he had learned that truth alone does not preserve a legacy. Mechanism does. It did not feel the same as revenge to him. It felt, in his rational moments, like preservation of children, property, a life built on paperwork and loyalty. Yet the act of preservation involved deception, and in that deception he recognized the first sorrow. It was not only that he had been fooled, but that he was now complicit in furthering the very thing he loathed. The moral ledger required entries on both sides. Henry kept them. When he watched Amora fold laundry on one recording and then, minutes later, touch a ring on her own hand in another, he catalogued the small betrayals, the half-truths of affection, the practiced altruism. He catalogued his own cruelty as well, the knowledge that his test had placed a mask over his face, that his pretending had made him a stranger in his own house. There were nights when he found he could not forgive himself for the watchfulness that made the house smaller, for the way children had begun to avoid certain conversations because adults moved like a pair of umbrellas above them. And yet the recordings kept arriving with a steadiness that was impossible to ignore. In a clip saved from the morning after a charity auction, Amora and Jake spoke in the kitchen with the raw familiarity of co-conspirators. Jake's hand, visible on the monitor as he sipped coffee, gestured with an impatience that suggested both affection and ambition. "We don't have to rush," he said. "He's fragile enough. Center the boys and wait. Money will follow." The words were not an instruction manual. They were an imagination of possibility. Henry felt all at once the simple and terrible consequence, that he had been ranked and calculated, that his life had been discussed as an obstacle to convenience. There was more. The evidence indicated they had deliberated who should maintain appearances and who should stay in the background. Evelyn, the infant, was not merely an accessory. She anchored them. Henry watched Jake hold her, as if rehearsing the posture he might take permanently. Amora, in a scene that had once seemed tender, now read differently. When she fed Evelyn porridge and murmured about keeping the story tight, the thing in Henry's chest that had once been brittle hardened. Betrayal is a language of patterns. She had been building one. He wrestled with the decision to confront privately. Men speak of confrontation as a tool. Henry knew it as a sharp edge. He thought of the boys and of the public life they shared. Headlines, the slow decay of reputation, and the possibility that truth might maim them more than deceit. He thought of his mother and her oak certainty, and of the night when she had stood in the doorway and said quietly, "If you do not look now, you will never know." The decision to continue the charade, to feign helplessness as a way to see, felt less like strategy and more like a crime against the intimacy he had once believed in. Amora continued to play the roles required of her. Around friends and in public, she was impeccable. A wife who fussed, a mother who organized, a woman who could glide and charm. In the private frames on the screen, she was more pragmatic, comforting when cameras watched, but calculating when they didn't. Henry noticed the small things that betray feeling. A delayed reply, a touch that retreated too quickly. He kept watching until the house became a theater of two audiences, one of which had no idea that the other existed. One evening, the feed showed Amora returning late from a dinner. On the footage, she moved through the hall with a purposeful rhythm, her bag slung low. Jake met her at the doorway, and the two shared a look that passed like a coin in a pocket. The camera had been aimed, in that room, to catch hands and faces. Their conversation, hushed, created a new kind of vertigo. They spoke of the night, as if arranging a theater performance. "We set it right, and then he will be out," Jake said, not with malice that was visible, but with an impatience that made Henry think of an animal cornered. He thought of the consequences, abstract and immense, and then, because he had sworn to evidence rather than assumption, he did not add inference to the file. He kept the recording, labeled it, and listened again. Seeds of fury took root in different forms. Sometimes it came as a sharp, private rage, a man who had been humiliated and sought to measure the damage. Sometimes it came in the form of protective calculation, thinking of the boys, who might lose more than a house. Their sense of identity, the sense that the world made sense because it had a father who would not be erased. He considered his options as if they were chess moves, but chess allows for checkmate. Life does not always offer such satisfaction. Meanwhile, Amora's behavior began to change in subtler ways. She mislaid simple tasks. She invented meetings in the name of charity. She slept with the curtains closed and emerged for public life like a moth from a sleeve. In the footage, sometimes she would pause at the study door as if listening. Sometimes she would pass the hallway with a hand touching her face, an unconscious search for bruise or mark. Henry wondered if she suspected anything, or if her inner theater remained as immaculate as her public one. On camera, she could be both actor and audience, and Henry watched performance after performance, cataloguing tone. The crucial turn came not from the footage alone, but from a small, domestic slip. One afternoon, while reviewing an older file, Henry spotted a small black dot on a wooden shelf in one of the guest room frames, an object only visible at an angle. He rewound the tape and watched it move in different lights until he realized it was a lens. The sight of it threw every polished gesture Amora had offered into new relief. Hidden cameras meant that others, too, had been watching. It meant that she was not the only one with a script. When he called a friend with the discovery, and the friend, terse and practical, advised nothing but caution, Henry felt the old, animal constriction in his chest. He did nothing publicly. He tightened the legal leash with Mr. Adiwal and let the paperwork start to pull the strings. He had the resources to do more than watch. He had the connections to immobilize if he wished, the financial apparatus that supported her artful life. He chose to prepare such moves quietly. Preparing felt perversely like a kind of mercy, a way to prevent the boys being uprooted unplanned, a way to keep his options open. Amora discovered one of the smaller cameras first. It was not a grand revelation. She found it in the linen cupboard, a black speck hidden among folded sheets. The footage on Henry's screen showed her fingers brush past it, then pause, then retrieve it with a look that might have been suspicion had she known what to do with it. She carried the camera to Jake in the guest room, and they inspected it as if examining evidence. When Jake's face changed, Henry saw something on the screen that made the room close. Impatience replaced the performative charm. "He knows," Jake said, and Amora's breath caught. She moved with a speed born of someone who knew the calculus of secrets. For a moment, the camera caught the raw edge of fear in her face. The way women and men look when their entire world can be undone by an instrument bound for a drawer. She paced the corridor, her steps too deliberate to be natural. Henry watched her through the grainy filter and felt his own certainty crack into shards of dread. She picked up the phone. She dialed. She spoke in clipped sentences that the screen captured like the echo of a bell. There was no profanity, no dramatic accusation. There were practical instructions, the sort favored by people who assume their lives are contracts rather than trusts. That night the house hummed with a new electricity. The boys slept in ignorance. Nathaniel's breathing was the steady metronome of youth. Jeffrey and Gabriel's dreams were of football and the sticky delight of school lunches. Henry sat in a dark room and watched his life in boxes. He felt the ethical cost of what he had done wrap around him like a heavy coat. He had traded the trust between spouses for a system of observation that had yielded certainty, but had also revealed deeper wounds. He considered at length whether the knowledge would heal or maim. Amora and Jake were moving now from the soft conspiracies of being lovers to the harder language of survival. The camera showed them whispering, counting scenarios, naming men Henry trusted by first name as if that made them less dangerous. They spoke of timing and presence and the need to make actions look unsuspicious. Jake was pragmatic in a way that made Henry sick, patient until opportunity turned to advantage. In the footage, he leaned close to Amora and said, with a confidence that had once been his charm and now seemed like cold steel, "When we do this, we will have what we need." Henry watched the phrase float across the screen and felt like he had been pushed off a cliff. He did not confront them immediately. He allowed himself one frayed moment of tenderness, to watch Nathaniel practice his scales in the living room, to hear Jeffrey sing nonsense into a recorder, to watch Gabriel fall asleep with his face pressed to a toy lion. Those were the human details that held him to being a man rather than a puppet of vengeance. The choice he feared most was not legal, it was moral. To take away their mother from the boys without ceremony, to hand them a fractured story that they would carry, to put them in the middle of a feud they had not asked for. He shivered at the image of their eyes asking for explanation, where none would be easy. When Amora realized there were cameras, she did not collapse into confession. Instead, she became pragmatic in a way Henry had never seen. She called a friend in town, a woman with a lawyer's tongue and a quick mind, and arranged to take the infant Evelyn out of the house that very night. The screen showed her gather things in a compact, polite urgency, her face flattened into a calm that was no longer performative, but required. Jake, who had been patient until patience had served its name, packed a bag with the same efficient hands he used to charm strangers. They moved like thieves and like lovers who had rehearsed an escape route. Henry watched them through the camera and felt both relief and a burn of grief. The relief came from the knowledge that, by leaving, they would not immediately act with the exact recklessness he had feared. The grief was for the quiet erosions of family life, the betrayal that had been stitched into it with such stubborn care. But he also knew the dangerous comfort of assuming that flight meant retreat. Plans left unexecuted wrinkle into future threats. A woman who departs with a child in her arms is not necessarily a woman who has renounced the eventuality of return. That night, under the bandage, and in the theater of his own making, Henry made a choice that would mark the coming weeks. He sent messages to Mr. Adiwal that were concise and without rancor. The asset lines to be placed under temporary control, the letters that might, in the hands of a prudent lawyer, preserve financial independence for his children. He made a call to a trusted friend whose reach remained unquestioned in the city's darker corners and asked, without moral justification, for the house to be kept under observation. He did not ask for violence. He asked only for presence, a watch that could replace the illusion of blindness with the truth of motion. The night ended with the house quieter than it had any right to be. Outside, the gates creaked on the wind. Amora and Jake had left with a child and a bag. The feeds captured the tale of their departure. A car maneuvering through the drive, brake lights like beads. Henry sat in the dark and let the color of the footage fade into memory. He had not yet confronted them directly. He had recorded the betrayal, secured the assets, and watched as they disappeared into the night. The test had done its job. It had revealed who his wife had become when he was not looking, and it had shown him the architecture of a conspiracy he could not lightly dismiss. Yet the revelation brought with it an unexpected and bitter clarity. It was one thing to prove unfaithfulness. It was another to acknowledge that a son he had raised as flesh and blood might not have been his, that the boys he loved could bear genetic ties to other men. The thought of legal battles and tests loomed like a second winter. Henry's hands, accustomed to signing things into being, trembled when he contemplated a paternity test. He had not ordered one. Perhaps, he thought, some truths are better left suspended between suspicion and certainty. But to live indefinitely with the doubt felt like a slow euthanasia of affection. For him, and he feared, for the boys. In the hours after her departure, his mother called. Her voice was small with the knowledge of his grief, and large with the kind of love that is not tender, but rescuing. "You have done the right thing," she said simply. "You had to know." He listened and did not correct her. In private he nursed the absurd shame of the deception he had put into motion. He had feigned need in order to unmask need. He had paid the price of temporarily dismantling his own dignity for the sake of salvaging a family he feared would otherwise be destroyed. The following morning, when the children woke, the house tried to resume normality. Henry moved slowly through the day, playing at father in the small ways that matter, making toast, answering a child's question in a voice tuned to calm. He kept the screen hidden beneath a valet of normality, waiting for a more deliberate moment to act. The cameras continued to watch and record, their lenses cold as the eyes of jurors. He stored each new clip in a folder labeled with dates and brief notes, as if method could grant him moral comfort. He had not yet shared the truth with Nathaniel. The elder boy's devotion to him remained absolute, in the way only a child's trust can be. Henry wanted to shield him long enough to choose a course that would not rupture a child's belief in his father completely. Yet every private truth delayed is a weight that grows heavier. To act too late would be to allow others to shape the story first. The recorded footage suggested more than betrayal. It implied intent. The details were hazy in parts, fragments stitched together by tone rather than facts. Henry knew that the law required more than suspicion. He also knew that the world supplied things to men who waited, rumors, rumor's cousin, and the slow erosion of reputation. He had to be careful. He had to choose between exposing the conspiracy publicly and dismantling it quietly. Either path would wound people he loved. Either path would leave him with an uneasy victory. And then, in the grey of late afternoon, a new clip appeared on the monitor, as if the house was offering him an answer. It showed Amora and Jake at the back of a cafe that they frequented under the convenience of anonymity. Audience noise muffled their voices, but the camera, placed with the kind of patience Henry had learned to command, captured a single phrase that felt like the faintest of nails being driven into the coffin of his earlier self. "Once it's done, we won't have to worry," Jake said. Henry turned the sound up and listened until the words blurred into the background of his life. He did not want to imagine what done meant. He refused to ascribe to it the particular cruelty his mind supplied in the dark. He had made a rule for himself. He would not give script to the worst possibilities. He would not imagine tools, methods, or timing. But he could not deny the intent behind the words. They were a statement of future possibility, and that was too much. Amora returned home 2 days later without Evelyn. She came back alone, her face a mask of composed exhaustion. People in the neighborhood noticed nothing. She was polished as always. Yet she moved with the slight stiffness of someone who had been seen acting outside the frame of performance. Henry watched her through the feed as she walked into the hall and paused, as if listening for sound. When she saw him, under the bandage, she stopped. Her face, for a beat, was a clear room. Then it closed. Confrontation had tightened to a single taut line. Henry had prepared legal buffers. He had written lists of questions he intended to ask. He had rehearsed the tone of calm that a man must keep to make a confession acceptable to the public. But there was another thing he had not prepared for. The way seeing the person you once loved assume an ordinary pose can be a violence in itself. He felt the old half-hope that perhaps their marriage, if not restored, could be salvaged from humiliation. The camera, that impartial witness, had already determined otherwise. He staged the moment with the detachment of someone who had grown used to being watched. He removed the bandage that had made him helpless and let the room adjust to the sight of him. Amora flinched as if at a blow. On the screen, hands trembled. He held up a small device, not violent, merely evidentiary, and told her, plainly, without flourish, what he had seen. The room did not explode with melodrama. It filled instead with the soft, terrible admission of small acts made large. Amora's eyes moved faster than her face. For a moment, she sought for any advantage, a phrase to reverse the arc of scorn. She found none. She folded like a person who had been rehearsing resilience and discovered she had been practicing avoidance. Her voice, when it came, tried the same tricks she had used for years, bargaining, minimizing, an appeal to the history they shared. Henry listened with the precise calm that had become his armor and his indictment. He did not shout. He did not grovel. He kept a stillness that was itself a verdict. The revelation that Jake might be Evelyn's father was not framed as an accusation to any sort of public tribunal. It was presented as evidence to the person who had been betrayed. Amora spoke of mistakes in tones that were equal parts regret and defiance. She said things meant to explain rather than excuse. Henry watched her mouth shape words that might have been true in their graduated way, and he recognized how people invent narratives to preserve themselves. The cameras, relentless as the weather, continued to register every nuance. She left the room in the end, not pushed, but carried by a momentum that was no longer physical. Henry watched her go, watched her shoulders incline as if to collect a child that was not present. The boys were not present for the moment of confession. He had spared them that. He had not spared them from every wound, but he had held fast to the one thing he thought he must, the preservation of memory in a way that would not immediately haunt them. For now, he told himself, they could still hold him as father. Outside the house, the city moved on as if nothing had happened. Inside, Henry sat among the detritus of a life that had rearranged itself. His mother placed a hand on his shoulder and said nothing. Mr. Adiwal sent messages indicating steps to preserve his children's financial standing. Dr. James asked for no detail while being a quiet, moral witness. David, when they met later in the study, did not offer triumph. He offered a bluntness that was kinder in its honesty. "You're a long way in now," David said. "You either finish this, or you let it fester." Henry thought of the children, of the quiet face of Nathaniel practicing piano in the next room, of Jeff and Gabriel, who did not yet know a world can be dishonest. He thought of Evelyn, the infant, who looked at him on the screen with the uncounted trust of a child unaware of paternity disputes. He thought of the consequences for them all. There is a cruelty in knowing that truth can be a knife, depending on who wields it and how. When night fell again, the house held its breath. Henry knew that the discovery of the hidden cameras had changed everything. It had revealed conspiracy, yes, but it had also made them all players in a theater of exposure. He had found the score. He had not yet played the final movement, and perhaps, he told himself as he scrubbed his face with both hands and felt an ache he could not name, perhaps not all truths should be delivered at once. There were still unanswered questions. What precisely had been said in those private exchanges he had not been able to decipher? Who else might know? Whether the men who moved in Jake's orbit had been involved in ways not yet shown. There were administrative questions too, the legal paths by which he could secure his children's future without humiliating them in court, the manner in which he might proceed to ensure Amora could not take Evelyn and vanish. For each of them, there were answers scribbled in the margins of his mind, to be explored with lawyers, with friends, with the blunt tools of influence he had always wielded with careful gloves. He could have called the police. He could have announced everything publicly and made the story a spectacle. Instead, he sat in the dim room and pressed his palms to his face and let the quiet out. He had obtained the evidence he wanted. He had arranged for a safe measure against the worst possibilities. But once truth had been caught on camera and placed in his hands, the pathway forward was not obvious. The moral price of his own deception, the fact that he had pretended to be blind in order to discover another blindness, sat heavy as a counterweight to the satisfaction of evidence. When he finally slept, it was a sleep like the sleep of a man who has been given a map to a minefield. He had found the tunnels. He had not yet crossed them. In the small hours of the morning, a message popped up on his phone from an unknown number, a short line of text that could have been a joke or a threat. "We are still in the house." Henry did not know whether it had been intended for him or for someone else. The message felt like a ripple across a pond he had thought had frozen. He saved it. He printed it. He stored it with the other things. It made the house less certain and the nights less restful. Outside, the city continued its ordinary cruelties. Newspapers would not yet know the story in full. The cameras that mattered were those he had installed himself. The real shock, he thought in the half-light, was not the discovery of his wife's betrayal. It was the knowledge that the safety he had built with money and reputation had been porous, where it mattered most. The people he had assumed stood with him did not speak on the evidence he had accumulated. Only a few knew. It was a fragile and solitary truth. He had meant, when the bandage first covered his eyes, to measure loyalty. He had measured instead the depth of deception and the lengths people will go to protect themselves and their desires. He had uncovered a plan, unsettling in its casualness. He had watched his wife's face turn into a landscape he no longer recognized. The house had been both stage and witness. The thing he had feared most had been given form on the screen. There was one last image he returned to, again and again, on fast forward and in slow motion. A small hand reaching for a man who was not him. It was a gesture that in other hands might have been tender. For Henry, it became a wound, a radical root of eroded trust. He reached to the small cupboard in his room and pulled out a photograph that had once been at the center of their wedding album. His hand clasped in Amora's, their smiles bright and unshadowed. He traced the outline of his own mouth in the glossy paper and found that, in the dark, he did not know whether the picture represented who they had been or the story they had performed. He had obtained evidence and he had preserved assets. He had kept the boys close and allowed their mother a narrow grace of departure with a child. He had, in short, set in motion a sequence he could not fully control. The questions that remained, the paternity of the boys-in-law and in the body's blood, the fate of Jake and his associates, the long-term whereabouts and intentions of Amora, were threads dangling from a cloth he had only halfway mended. Night folded into morning. Henry rose and sat at his desk, the photograph between his fingers. He knew the next moves would require a mixture of the legal, the social, and the deeply personal. Conversations with people who could not be trusted. Decisions that would wound even as they fortified. He had learned what many men in power learn too late. That possessions are not substitutes for love, and that surveillance built to confirm the truth often yields only more questions. He switched on the screen, and for the 100th time, watched a recording where Jake held a child and told the infant soothing things, things that had no place in a conspiracy, but which both humanized and condemned the man. He did not yet call the police. He did not yet let the world know. He had evidence, and he had doubt. He had a plan, and he had a ruinous gravity that pulled at him even as he tried to anchor himself. Outside the gates, a car passed and the city moved, indifferent. Inside the house, Henry sat with the knowledge of what he had learned and the unresolved ache of what he must now become. Not merely a man betrayed, but an architect of consequences. He understood that the test he had set in motion had delivered results, and those results would not straighten themselves into a neat resolution. They would be messy, moral, layered. They would lead to choices he could not undo. He looked at the photograph again, and for a long time, simply looked. The house held its breath, and somewhere beyond the monitors, decisions were already being made in voices Henry could not yet hear. If the recordings could show him who had betrayed him, they could not by themselves heal the wound they had opened. The true work had only begun. If you want to follow what happens next and see the full unraveling of the story, subscribe to Stay Tuned. Henry rose from his chair and walked through the corridor where lights burned low. He paused outside Nathaniel's door and listened to the soft scrape of a bow on strings. For a wild second he pictured himself stepping into the doorway and saying everything. The recordings, the hidden cameras, the small, terrible evidence that made the world he had built look like glass blown thin. He pictured Nathaniel's face crumpling in a way that could not be mended by money or eloquence. He pictured the boy asking the single question that could not be dressed in corporate statements. Am I still your son? Henry felt his resolve falter and, in that instant of potential confession, he chose silence. The child practicing the scales in the next room would wake tomorrow with a life unchanged if he could help it. That choice, more than any legal maneuver, would define the man he would be now. The next sequence of hours happened with the cool ruthlessness of someone used to arranging other people's lives. He convened a narrow set of allies and kept the circle tighter than before. Mr. Adiwal walked through contracts with a lightness that made them seem inevitable. Dr. James sat with a measured face and took no pleasure in the role he had been asked to play. David stayed as he always had, blunt, short with sentiment, long on practicality. They did not debate morality. They organized. That, too, was a kind of grief. To find solace in the competence of others while grieving what those measures would cost. Assets were not seized in a public act, but placed under legal hold. Paperwork signed in a sequence that would make it difficult for Amora to tap accounts or shift property without notice. Mr. Adiwal moved carefully. His language was technical and careful, because he knew how quickly a well-placed word could be weaponized in a courtroom or a newspaper column. Henry had no appetite for spectacle. He wanted containment, an ironware of precaution, so the boy's future could not be gambled away in the heat of reprisal. He authorized surveillance of a different kind, Where once the house's feeds had been for his eyes only, he placed trusted men at positions outside the home's orbit. He did not ask for blood or violence. He asked only for presence. Yet, in the city's hinterland, there are men for whom presence takes a harder shape, and Henry, who had once pulled strings to close down a riot and reopen a theatre in the same week, made a call that would draw a different sort of attention. Jake, who had believed himself discreet and necessary, was not a man the law would have sought without cause. But Henry's reach touched corners where formal warrants were an inconveniently slow thing. Within hours of Amora's discovery of a camera and the brief, strained conversation that followed, men in uniform arrived at a house where Jake had taken temporary refuge. The footage Henry watched later showed no cinematic glory, only the blunt mechanics of men being taken into custody. There was scuffling at the threshold, raised voices. Jake resisted, and for that resistance he was handled. The camera that had revealed him to Henry later captured him below the height of dignity, dragged to the pavement, pushed into the back of a van, hauled away amid lights and the murmurs of bystanders who would never know the reason. Henry did not watch that part for pleasure. He watched because evidence had to be followed by action, and because he had chosen, consciously, painfully, to make sure a threat was not left to drift in the margins of his children's lives. He told himself he had not ordered violence. He had authorized presence. It was a distinction that felt less comforting in the wake of what he had seen on the screen. Jake, bruised and furious, shouting accusations that the camera could only record with clinical impartiality. Later, a terse message from a friend in the city's security apparatus informed him that Jake had been detained. The exact legal outcome was indefinido. Henry folded that uncertainty into the pile of other suspended certainties and tried to breathe. Amora's response to the arrest, or to the rumor of it, was neither dramatic collapse nor tempestuous rage. She moved with the same composed economy she had used since their marriage. When men came to the kitchen to speak with her, she greeted them politely, as if they were guests at a party, rather than emissaries of consequence. But in private, she cracked. There were moments, caught on the unobtrusive cameras Henry had left in motion, where she pressed her forehead to the window and let a single sound escape that was not quite a sob and not quite a curse. Henry watched and felt the old ache, a complicated, layered grief that was equal parts betrayal and loss. The most dangerous night arrived in a way that felt almost cruelly ordinary. There was no overt screaming to herald it, no dramatic storm. It began with tea. Amora always did the tea with ritualized patience. There was a way she would place the cup, stir a spoon the exact number of turns, and hold the saucer against the table with a quiet, habitual grace. That evening, she brought him a cup in the study, the way she had many times before. He had arranged the meeting with a deliberate casualness that was itself a performance. Enough affability to avoid arousing suspicion, enough distance to maintain control. He refused to drink. The refusal was not theatrical. It was simple and practical. He had learned the currency of minor refusals in the weeks since he had begun watching. He had seen hands move with intent in footage. He had seen a casual phrase become a plan in the quiet. There is a moment when a man who has pretended to be what he is not realizes the ultimate irony. He had chosen blindness to see. Now he chose sight to avoid harm. Amora, at first, spoke as if mending, soft explanations, small corrections of tone. Her fingers trembled as she set the cup down, and in that tremble Henry heard the sound of a woman cornered. She tried the scripts that had served her in social circles. Apology thinly disguised as practicality. Lament dressed as misunderstanding. Henry kept his face measured. He had rehearsed the questions he needed answered, and the evidence he would use. But rehearsals are poor armor against the nakedness of a human apology. When he removed his bandage that night, it was not with triumph. It was with a precise, almost surgical calm. The reveal was electric in the room, not because of the dramatic gesture, but because the person who had been playing a part had to meet the person who had pretended to need them. Amora flinched, as if the action itself were an accusation. Henry set a small portable screen on the table and played, one after another, the clips he had gathered. The laugh in the cafe, the whispered phrase about when it's done, the casual certainty over who would center the boys. He did not shout. He placed the footage before her like cold evidence on a coroner's table. She watched as if watching a distant person. For a while she chose not to speak, and in that silence Henry found a kind of clarity. When she finally did speak, it was in a voice that yielded none of the old vanity. Her explanations were sharp-edged, sometimes mercifully candid. She spoke of loneliness in a language Henry had not wanted to hear, the boredom that had crept like moss through their marriage, the craving for validation that had been fed not by malice, but by habit of being admired elsewhere. She admitted that sympathy had sometimes been easier to seek than conversation. In those moments her words were not just confession, but rationalization. When Henry asked the questions that mattered, who fathered Evelyn, what sort of plan had been contemplated, her answers were sleeker than the truth, and not small enough to feel like lies. She acknowledged that Nathaniel had been fathered by him. She admitted that the other two might not be. She did not open a courtroom of evidence. She gave him a narrow, human truth. "I know what I have done," she said. "I know what this means." The confession did not absolve her. It did not need to. It simply reoriented the room. It was at that brittle moment that the plan Amora and Jake had been sketching met the force Henry had chosen to apply. He produced a recorder he had not shown earlier, one that captured, in greater fidelity, Bruce's conversations and the details that left him in no doubt of intent. Amora's face changed. She recognized the depth of the evidence at last. She stopped bargaining and started pleading for what she had always asked for in other forms, a promise that would preserve the life she knew. Henry did not give it. The meeting that followed was not a melodramatic public spectacle. Mr. Adiwal sat opposite Amora and read aloud a compact of legal constraints that would protect the children's financial future until a more formal resolution could be reached. Henry watched, feeling both the relief of having taken measures and the ache of their necessity. Amora signed not because she consented, but because she had few options that did not involve a courtroom or a headline. The papers did not erase the hurt. They simply made it impossible for her to take immediate, ruinous action. When the men who had detained Jake returned with the news that he had been transported to a holding center, Henry felt an angular, chastened satisfaction. The men had been forceful in their handling. There was nothing picturesque about the scene. He watched the grainy footage where Jake was led from a parked van, hooded in places by a hat and the blur of movement. There were injuries visible, bruises, a split lip, but no vivid detail. Someone had been rough with him. Henry felt a sudden dizzy revulsion at the price others had paid on his behalf. He had ordered safety, and found that safety had a cost he had not fully calculated. That night, Amora gathered her things and left the house with Evelyn. It was neither escape nor triumph. It was an exit with the look of compulsion. She left with minimal protest, collecting a child and a bag as if moving from one rehearsal to another. The house that had watched her for weeks registered the motion and then the absence. Henry sat alone in the room where a bandage had once made him the vessel of observation. The photograph on the side table, his hand clasped with hers, smiles unshadowed, looked older than memory. He chose, publicly and privately, to keep the boys. There was a private reckoning in the decision. He could have used the legal hold to limit even their access. He could have turned them into armaments in a legal war. Instead, he made a different calculation. Children, he believed, should not be collateral in the adult contests of love and wealth. He wanted their lives to contain as little of the spectacle as possible. He told himself it was for them, not for his pride. In the quiet of the bedroom, as he tacked another photograph to the wall, he admitted to himself that part of his motive was also self-preservation. To hold close the ties that were still undoubtedly his, that still spoke to the idea of family beyond betrayal. The boys sensed the change before they had the language for it. Nathaniel, perceptive and protective, watched his father with a new wariness. He asked no questions about the absent mother. He asked instead whether Henry would attend his next rehearsal and whether breakfast would be later on practice mornings. Henry kept answering with small reassurances and, whenever he could, with ordinary acts that resembled fatherhood. He made porridge, helped with homework, and let Nathaniel play the piece that always made the house feel less like a collection of rooms and more like a home. The immediate legal threats were tamped down. Temporary controls on accounts and properties were placed in legal limbo, enough to prevent a sudden transfer of wealth, but not so severe as to make headlines about a family in freefall. Mr. Adewale worked with a steady hand, drafting letters and obtaining temporary orders that, for the moment, would prevent Amora from liquidating assets. Henry's strategy was twofold: preserve the children's material security and reserve the right to disclose publicly only when he had to. He did not crave vengeance in print. He craved the chance to keep his boys safe. In streets and cafes, friends and critics murmured. Rumor, as ever, was quicker than law. Some acquaintances took refuge in the old habit of picking sides before facts had the chance to be established. Others withdrew, as if the mere suggestion of scandal might soil them. Henry, who had once navigated the city's subtle economies with ease, found the social calculus now to be thin and brutal. He lost alliances that had nothing to do with the facts, and kept friends who, in quieter ways, had always loved him for who he was, rather than what he offered the world. For his part, Henry tried to be unrecognizably ordinary. He kept a low profile. He accompanied Nathaniel to a recital and clapped louder than was necessary. He took Geoffrey and Gabriel to a park, where they invented games with sticks and laughed in the way that children do, unself-conscious and unaware of the gravity their fathers carried. During those excursions, Henry felt like a man practicing a role he wanted to be real. He longed for the easy felicities of being a father who could reassure without ulterior motive. But he also had to contend with the knowledge that truth often requires hazardous acts to secure it. Jake's detention was the most immediate example. The city had taken a man into custody on the basis of a set of circumstances. Whether he would be charged, tried, or convicted was indefinido. Those legal outcomes would unfold in their slow, bureaucratic ways. Henry had records, he had footage, he had witnesses. But the law is not a theater where evidence always leads to tidy endings. He had to live with that uncertainty. Amora's exile with Evelyn became a medial fulcrum for discussion in people's private conversations, and in the pages of outlets that liked nothing better than a human interest angle with a hint of scandal. Some speculated she had left with money smuggled away. Others insisted she had been a victim of Henry's control. Henry read these things and did not respond. He had chosen containment rather than publicity because he believed the children deserved a quieter route through the storm. Yet the public's appetite for story meant the shadows of his choices extended longer than he expected. The weeks that followed were strewn with small legal battles and larger emotional reckonings. There were meetings with counselors for the boys, more paperwork than he wanted, and evenings where he sat with his mother on the quiet upstairs veranda and watched the street lamps throw long, melancholic columns across the lawn. Mrs. Helen said little. Her counsel had always been understated. She would reach for his hand in the dark and squeeze. It was a small, steady salve. "You did what you had to do," she said in the clipped voice that had once ordered him to his senses as a boy. He wanted to agree without reservation. He could not. At times, Henry found himself haunted by the mechanics of the test he had set in motion. He had staged blindness, turned the intimacy of a marriage into a theater of observation, and in doing so had become the kind of man he had once derided in others. He had watched his wife betray him, yes, but he had also sifted through the detritus of his own choices and found his hands not entirely clean. The trade-off between knowledge and innocence, he realized, was never free. He had robbed himself of the naive faith that had made earlier years tender. In its place rose a wary competence that did not always feel like a moral improvement. There were, nevertheless, moments of a strange, fragile peace. Nathaniel once climbed into his lap and performed for him a fragment of a sonata he had been practicing. The boy's fingers were awkward but earnest. When he finished, he looked up and asked with the blunt honesty of youth whether everything would be all right. Henry did not answer in large declarations. He put his hand at the boy's hair and said, "We'll get through it." The phrase was both promise and an admission that the future was not yet known. Amora's whereabouts became intermittent information passed along by intermediaries and sympathetic acquaintances. She sent letters that were formal and brittle. She made one visit under supervision to see the boys before an agreement was finalized. In that meeting, her face was set like limestone, and then, for a second, softened by maternal instinct. The boys were puzzled at the way grown-ups moved through their world now. The hurried goodbyes, the whispered conversations, the grown men who seemed to carry secrets like stones. Henry took no pleasure in seeing them suffer confusion. He took only the professional clarity of a man who had to make decisions for those who could not make them themselves. The legal apparatus did its slow dance. Temporary custody measures, supervised visits, and asset holds created a scaffolding that would, perhaps, hold long enough for some resolution to form. Whether that resolution would lead to courtroom battles or private agreements was indefinido. Henry had prepared contingency plans, but he could not prepare for everything. Men with power learn quickly that certainty is rarely a permanent fixture. Jake, meanwhile, had become a cautionary tale in the city's quieter salons. The images of him hauled to a van circulated in grainy, sympathetic captions. Some saw in him a victim of Henry's connections. Others saw a man who had chosen a dangerous game and lost. In the jail's dull rooms, he had time to rage and time, perhaps, to regret. Henry did not watch those scenes with relish. He felt only the grim knowledge that a life had been altered, perhaps irrevocably. The letter from Jake's lawyer, short, brusque, demanding details, arrived in Henry's private inbox, and for a moment he considered whether he had done something irredeemable. Then he reminded himself of the tape where conspiratorial laughter had grown complacent, and where words implied a threat he could not ignore. There were nights when Henry would awaken and sit by the window, the stripped city lights, a scattered constellation, thinking about the architecture of trust. He had always believed that power could purchase calm. What he had learned was more stark. Money could secure a life, but it could not buy loyalty. His test had proved that loyalty, when it was not freely given, would not survive the probing. The knowledge arrived like frost, beautiful to behold in the morning light, but lethal to tender shoots. In the aftermath, the household settled into a new, unfashionable normal. The boys resumed lessons and grew in ways children do, sometimes oblivious, sometimes perceptive, beyond their years. Nathaniel continued to practice the piano. Geoffrey and Gabriel returned to football on Saturday mornings and dirtied their socks with reckless enthusiasm. Henry found himself stealing glances at Nathaniel's face in crowded rooms, trying to assess what the future had etched there. He loved them with a fierce, not always graceful, tenderness. Amora's exile with Evelyn became, for now, the shape of their separation. She had custody in a practical sense for the infant. Henry allowed it because he believed a baby should not be shuttled into the center of a legal war. Whether that situation would be permanent was indefinido. He kept silent on certain matters in public to avoid contaminating young lives with the salacious details that would do nothing but wound. Yet privately, the sense of having been deceived left a residue that colored every ordinary kindness with suspicion. The city's gossip did not let the story die, and Henry felt the small indignities of half-truths and invented narratives. He was described in some circles as a controlling patriarch, in others as the injured husband fighting for his family. Neither label felt entirely accurate. He had been both wronged and culpable. He had orchestrated a deception and then castigated its fruits. That complexity left him weary. Time, in the months that followed, was a slow, awkward physician. Open wounds thickened into callus. The initial rush of action, the installation of cameras, the arrests, the legal maneuvers, became the bones of a story he would return to in sleepless hours. He still watched some footage, not to relive, but to ensure no new threat loomed. He did not gloat. He did not celebrate. He tended to his sons and his mother, and in those acts he sought some redemption. One small event stayed with him. A letter from Jake slipped in through channels a week after he had been taken. It was brief, unsigned in parts, and full of the kind of petulant bravado men who had been used to getting their way sometimes employ. "You were always 2 moves ahead," the note read in one line. "But not the only one to move." Henry folded the paper and placed it in the drawer with the others. The words implied threats and pride and, perhaps, apology rashly dressed. They meant nothing definitive. They meant only that nothing had been finally settled. There remained the deep, private wound that could not be bandaged by contracts or court documents, the question of blood and belonging. Nathaniel's biological paternity had been asserted as Henry's in the exchanges he had heard. The other 2 boys' lines were in doubt. The legal resolution of such doubts requires tests and time, and often a brutality of language that can flatten childhood. Henry deferred that brutality. He kept the boys and let the question rest, unresolved, at least for the near future. To say nothing was also a choice, one that might preserve the boy's sense of stability, yet at the cost of his own uneasy certainty. In the evenings, Henry would return to solitary lapses of thought. He was a man who had been willing to pretend to be what he was not to see what others did. The test had revealed treachery, but had also revealed his own capacity for deception. He had learned a lesson about the limits of surveillance and the moral cost of living behind screens. He knew he had done damage that no legal document could entirely undo. He had taken his family apart to see whether it would hold, and in doing so had found that the act of test could do as much harm as the wrongdoing it was meant to expose. The final image that lingered for him was stark in its simplicity. Evelyn's small hand reaching for another man, the touch that had once been tenderness but now read as confirmation of other loyalties. He placed the photograph of his wedding back in the album, and when he closed it he felt the cover click with a sound that signaled an ending but not a finish. He kept his public life measured. He answered invitations with nonchalance, made appearances that suggested steadiness. Behind closed doors, he recalibrated his life around children, legal safeguards, and the slow mending of a heart that had been both broken and hardened. He felt the persistent ache of loss. A marriage stripped of illusions, a home that was both sanctuary and crime scene, a love that had been chosen and betrayed and then chosen again in a different, chastened kind of devotion. As the weeks became months, the city accepted a new arrangement. Stories circulated. Some gave Henry the benefit of doubt, others denounced him. Jake's long-term fate was indefinido. Whether a trial would follow, whether the courts would sift meaningfully through the recordings and decide on guilt, was not yet known. Nathaniel's paternity remained emotionally and legally unresolved in some corners. The question, too, was indefinido. Those blanks hung like unfinished sentences in the margins of Henry's life. On a quiet night, When the boys were asleep and the house had settled into an uncompromising silence, Henry sat alone with his mother. They did not speak at length. He pressed a hand to the photograph and then, in a small, unceremonious act, removed it from its frame and placed it face down in a drawer. The thing that had once been a memorial to his proudest hour had become a complicated relic. He had, in the end, learned what the test had delivered, and at what cost. He had pretended to be blind to test his wife's loyalty, and what happened next had shocked everyone in ways that no one had predicted, him least of all. The revelation had done what he had wanted. It had made the truth visible. But visibility had proved to be a double-edged gift. Henry had gained the truth and lost an imagined innocence. He had preserved his children's future materially, while imperiling the simple, unquestioning trust he had once relied on. There was a brittle hope in him, a small, stubborn belief that the boys' laughter might one day outlast the stain of betrayal. He could not promise healing. He could only promise presence. As he turned off the light and the house inhaled the dark, he gave himself that promise anew and wondered at the choices that had led him there, the test, the cameras, the removal of a bandage that had been worn not only to compel truth, but to punish the possibility of being deceived. If you were in Henry's shoes, what would you have done? Tell us in the comments, and if you want to follow the remaining questions, Nathaniel's paternity and Jake's fate, watch part 2 for the answers on what comes next.